Somewhere on the south shore of Lake Superior, in the last years before the century turned, a priest sat across from an old Anishinaabe man and asked him a question that had been driving white antiquarians half out of their minds for 50 years. Who dug the pits? The priest belonged to a tradition that took these people seriously. Decades earlier, a Slovenian missionary named Frederick Baraga had walked thousands of miles through the deep snow to live among the Lake Superior Ojibwe. They called him the snowshoe priest. He sat with native speakers for years and built the largest dictionary of their language anyone had ever assembled. So when a man like that asked his question, he expected an answer he could write down and carry back. A name, a tribe, a vanished people who had come before. The old man gave him an answer. But it was not the answer anyone in a lecture hall in Boston or Washington wanted to hear, and for the next 100 years, almost nobody would listen to it. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. This is the story of some of the oldest minds on Earth, the people who got erased from their own history, and the lie that was invented to justify taking their land. It is also the story of why that exact same lie is trending again right now, wearing a brand new costume. So stick with me, because the ending is going to sound a lot more familiar than you expect. Let's go back to the pits. If you fly over Isle Royale today, the long wooded island that sits in Lake Superior closer to Canada than to Michigan, you are looking at a wilderness, moose and wolves, almost no people. It is one of the least visited national parks in the entire country. But hidden under the trees and the moss, there are thousands of holes in the ground. Pits, some shallow, some sunk deep into solid bedrock. They run in lines that follow the veins of copper buried in the rock, the same way a modern geologist would trace them. And they were not dug last century, or the century before that. Some of them were being worked when the pyramids at Giza were brand new. For a long time, nobody could explain them. When the first American surveyors arrived in the middle of the 1800s, they found these ancient workings all over the region. On Isle Royale, along the Keweenaw Peninsula, that thumb of land that juts up into the lake, down through Ontonagon and Houghton counties. In some places, the old miners had followed a vein of copper more than 60 feet straight down into the earth, with nothing but stone and fire and muscle. And when the surveyors climbed down into those pits, they found the tools still lying there. Stone hammers, thousands of them, rounded river cobbles worn from pounding, wooden levers preserved in the wet ground, and in one famous case, a mass of pure copper weighing thousands of pounds, partly lifted, propped up on timbers, and then simply abandoned in place, as if the workers had set down their tools one afternoon and walked away, and never come back. Here is the part that makes the whole thing so strange. This copper did not need to be smelted. Almost everywhere else on the planet, if you want metal, you have to dig up ore, then heat it in a furnace to melt the metal out of the rock. That is a whole technology. Lake Superior is different. The copper there comes out of the ground as pure native metal. You can find slabs of it lying in the dirt. The ancient miners would build fires against the rock to crack it, pour water on it, pound the copper loose with those stone hammers, and then work it cold, hammering it into knives, spear points, fish hooks, beads, and bracelets. No furnace, no smelting, just an intimate, patient relationship with the stone, passed down over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And that stretch of time is the thing that breaks your brain a little. Because we are not talking about a few centuries. Copper was being worked in this region as far back as 7,000, maybe 9,000 years ago. The intensive mining seems to have peaked around 6,000 years ago, and then continued on and off for thousands of years after that. Archaeologists call the people who did this the Old Copper Culture, or the Old Copper Complex. It is some of the oldest metalworking found anywhere in the world. Older than the copper working in much of the ancient Near East. It was happening here, in the woods of the upper Great Lakes, while most of humanity was still figuring out farming. Then, somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, the intense mining slowed down and, in places, stopped. We know this now from a clever piece of science. Researchers pulled sediment cores out of the bottoms of quiet coves and lakes near the old mines, cores that trap a year-by-year record of what was in the air and water. And in the mud, they can read the pollution. When people mine and heat copper, they leave behind traces of lead and copper and potassium in the sediment. The record shows a long, intense pulse of that pollution starting thousands of years ago, and then a clean, sharp drop-off, as if a switch had been flipped. After that, the record goes quiet. It stays quiet until the mid-1800s, when a very different kind of miner shows up. But we will get to those people, because they are central to this story. Why did the ancient mining slow down and stop? Nobody knows for certain, and any honest telling has to admit that. The researchers who read those sediment cores noticed something suggestive, though. The drop-off in mining seems to line up with a shift in the climate, a stretch of drier conditions settling over the Great Lakes around the same time. Maybe the easy copper near the surface had been worked out after thousands of years, and the effort stopped paying off. Maybe people moved, or changed how they lived, or shifted their trade. Probably it was some tangle of all of those things at once. What matters is that the mining did not stop because a mysterious civilization was wiped out overnight. It wound down the way human activities usually wind down, gradually, for ordinary reasons, over generations. There is no massacre in the mud. There is just weather and time and people adapting. And while it lasted, the reach of that copper was astonishing. This was not a local craft that stayed in the North Woods. Lake Superior copper travelled. Archaeologists have traced it hundreds and hundreds of miles from the mines, worked into ornaments and tools and ceremonial objects found in burial mounds across the Midwest and down the Mississippi. At the Hopewell sites in Ohio, copper from these lakes was hammered into stunning effigies, birds of prey with outstretched wings, and buried as sacred objects, treated as something alive and holy. Copper moved south to Poverty Point in Louisiana, one of the great ancient centers of North America. To move that metal that far, you need canoes, rivers, portages, relationships between distant communities, and generations of trust. In other words, you need exactly the kind of connected, sophisticated indigenous world that the lost race myth was specifically designed to deny. So the pits were real, the scale was staggering. And by the time white geologists were mapping them in the 1850s and 60s, one question hung over everything. Who did this? Now, you would think the obvious first move would be to ask the people who actually lived there. The Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, who had been in this country for as far back as their own history reached, who still worked copper, who still traded it, who still held the metal as sacred. That would be the reasonable thing to do. And some of them did ask. That is where our priest in the mission house comes in. But here is where the story takes its first ugly turn, because the answers the Ojibwe gave were not treated as evidence. They were treated as folklore. Charming, maybe. Useless as history. And a whole industry of respectable men set about inventing a different answer, one that had nothing to do with the people standing right in front of them. Let me show you how that machine worked, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In 1850, two government geologists, named Foster and Whitney, examined the pits and confirmed something important. These were made by human hands. They were ancient. They had been abandoned for a very long time. Good so far. In 1862 and 1863, Charles Whittlesey, a Michigan state geologist, published careful maps and descriptions of the ancient mines for the Smithsonian, work that scholars still reference. By 1881, another geologist, N. H. Winchell, was writing about the ancient copper mines of Isle Royale in a popular science magazine, putting the mystery in front of a national audience. The evidence was piling up. The mines were real, they were old, and they were enormous. But almost none of these men were willing to say the simple, correct sentence, that the ancestors of the native people who lived there had done it. Instead, the theories got wild. Maybe it was the Aztecs, who had migrated up from Mexico and then retreated. Maybe it was the Phoenicians sailing across the Atlantic in secret, maybe the Vikings, maybe survivors of a lost continent, maybe a mysterious, vanished, and, this part is important, imagined as light-skinned civilization that had built a mighty empire in the heart of North America and then been wiped out by savage invaders. And who were those savage invaders supposed to be in this story? The Native Americans, the very people who could actually trace their history to this land. By 1928, this had gotten so out of hand that the president of the Zenith Radio Corporation, a vice president of Colgate-Palmolive, and a crew of gentlemen, archaeologists, loaded up their yachts in Chicago and sailed to Isle Royale, specifically to hunt for signs of ancient Norsemen and Aztecs. Not to study the people who were actually there, to find evidence of anyone but them. If you think that sounds like a fringe obsession from a handful of cranks, I need you to understand how deep this idea ran, because it went all the way to the top, and it did real damage. This was not just about copper. Copper was one chapter in a much bigger and much darker book, and the book has a name. Historians call it the mound builder myth. All across the eastern United States, especially in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, there are enormous earthen mounds and geometric earthworks. Some are shaped like animals. Some are precise circles and squares that go on for acres. Some are burial mounds packed with beautiful copper artifacts, much of that copper traced right back to Lake Superior, carried hundreds of miles along ancient trade routes to places like the Hopewell sites in Ohio and Poverty Point down in Louisiana. That trade network alone should tell you something. These were not isolated, scattered people. This was a continent laced together by commerce and craft, thousands of years before Columbus. But when white settlers looked at those mounds, a lot of them refused to believe that the native peoples living nearby could have built them. Same move as the copper pits. The monuments were too impressive, too organized, too civilized, so, the reasoning went, they must have been built by somebody else, a superior lost race, and the Indians must have destroyed them. Now watch what that story does. If a great civilized race built the mounds, and the ancestors of today's Native Americans wiped that race out and stole their land, then the Native Americans are not the rightful owners of anything. They are just the latest conquerors. And that means when white Americans take the land in turn, they are not really committing a theft. They are just restoring the natural order. They are avenging a lost civilization. You can practically feel the guilt draining out of the room. This was not a subtle subtext. It was said out loud by the most powerful men in the country. Andrew Jackson invoked the vanished race of mound builders in his address to Congress in 1829, laying the groundwork for the policy that became the Indian Removal Act, the law that drove tens of thousands of native people off their homelands and killed a huge number of them on the way. William Henry Harrison, before he was president, wrote about the mound builders and their supposed destruction, and he understood exactly how useful that story was for justifying the removal of living native people. The myth got repeated, endorsed, and spread by presidents, preachers, and respected scientists for the better part of a century. And the maddening thing is, they already knew better. Thomas Jefferson, of all people, had personally excavated a burial mound on his own land decades earlier, dug into it carefully in layers, looked at the evidence, and concluded that it was the work of the ancestors of Native Americans. He got it right. His conclusion was available. It was just inconvenient. So it got buried under a mountain of romantic nonsense about lost white empires, because the nonsense was more useful. And this is the part people find hardest to believe, so let me be clear about it. This was not just barroom gossip or dime novel fantasy. This idea got dressed up in the robes of science. Through the 1800s, a whole strand of what we now call scientific racism worked to rank human beings, and to argue that some peoples were simply incapable of building anything grand. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Measure enough skulls, publish enough learned papers, and you could make cruelty look like scholarship. The lost race theories about the mounds and the copper mines drew strength from that atmosphere. If your starting assumption is that the native peoples in front of you are stuck in a permanent childhood of savagery, then of course you go looking for somebody else to credit. The conclusion was decided before the evidence was ever examined. That is the opposite of how science is supposed to work, but it wore the costume convincingly enough to fool a nation for 100 years. It took until 1894 for the federal government's own Bureau of American Ethnology, led by a researcher named Cyrus Thomas, to publish a massive report that finally, officially, demolished the mound builder myth. After 2 decades of fieldwork, Thomas concluded what Jefferson had concluded and what the native people had been saying the entire time. Native Americans built the mounds. There was no lost race. There never had been. But by then the myth had done its work. The land was gone. The removals had happened. And a false version of American history was baked so deep into the culture that we are still digging it out today. So now let's go back to that mission house, back to the old man and the priest and the question, who dug the pits? Because here is what I think is the most important part of this whole story, and it is the part that almost never gets told. When the Ojibwe were asked about the copper, they did not give a blank stare. They gave an answer. It just was not the kind of answer a European mind was trained to accept as history. To the Anishinaabe, copper was not an industrial resource. It was alive. One 19th century Ojibwe man, when he tried to explain the metal to a listener who was writing it down, described it with a phrase that a modern archaeologist, Susan Martin, of Michigan Technological University, later used as the title of an entire book about these mines. He called it Wonderful Power. Copper helped people stay healthy. It helped in the hunt. It was a gift, and it carried spirit. You did not simply extract it. You were in a relationship with it, and copper had a guardian. In Ojibwe tradition, the Great Lakes and rivers are home to a being called Missionary, the underwater panther, sometimes called the Great Lynx. A creature with the face and body of a cat, spines down its back, and horns of copper. Missionary is the protector of the copper. You can still see it painted in red ochre on the cliffs at Agawa Rock on the Canadian shore of Lake Superior, where the pictographs have looked out over the water for generations. Ojibwe tradition tells of the great leader and shaman Shingwao Konsei and the spirit that guarded the metal. To take copper without the proper respect, without the proper relationship, was dangerous. It could cost you. This was not superstition standing in for knowledge. It was knowledge, wrapped in the form a culture uses to carry its most important truths across time. The lesson inside the story is real. Copper mattered. It was not to be taken lightly or greedily or without understanding what you were touching. It is worth pausing on the man who wrote so much of this language down, because he was not one of the villains here. Frederick Baraga, the snowshoe priest, was a Slovenian who trained as a lawyer before he became a priest, and he arrived among these people in the 1830s, in the very years the Indian Removal Act was tearing native communities apart across the country. He learned the language deeply enough to build a grammar and a dictionary that scholars still use, and he used what he had to fight the removals. When the government pushed to drive the Lake Superior Ojibwe west off their homelands, Baraga fought it, leaning on his legal training. On more than one occasion he bought land outright and then deeded it over to Ojibwe leaders so that no one could force them off it. He was flawed, and he was a man of his church and his century, and the mission project as a whole did real harm to native cultures that people are still reckoning with honestly today. But it tells you something that the outsider who took the Ojibwe most seriously, who actually sat and listened and wrote their words down with care, was also one of the few who fought to let them keep their ground. Listening and respect turned out to be connected. So did contempt and theft. Do you see what happened here? The priest wanted a tribe name. He wanted a label he could file next to Aztec or Phoenician. What the old man offered instead was a world view. He was telling him, in effect, that the copper had always belonged to this world, to these waters, to this people, and their relationship with the spirit that guarded it. He was not pointing to some vanished race that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared. He was describing an unbroken thread that ran from the deep past straight to the man sitting in the room, and that was exactly the answer the recorders could not hear, because it did not fit the story they needed. A living native tradition that claimed the copper, that claimed the deep past, that claimed continuity with the ancient miners, that was the one answer that made the land grab harder to justify. So it got written down as a quaint legend, filed away and ignored, while the search for the lost race sailed on in its yachts. Now here is where the knife really turns, because I promised you the second kind of miner, and this is where they arrive. In the early 1840s, through a series of treaties, the Lake Superior Ojibwe were pressured into ceding vast tracts of their land, including the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale, the exact ground those ancient pits were sunk into. The timing was not a coincidence. Word of the copper had gotten out, geologists had confirmed the wealth in the rock, and suddenly the land the Ojibwe had lived on for as long as anyone could remember became something the government urgently wanted signed over. Treaty negotiations of that era were rarely fair meetings of equals. They happened under pressure, under the shadow of removal, with translation problems, broken promises, and the constant threat of what would happen if you refused. The Ojibwe managed to hold on to more than many nations did, and their descendants are still there, still fighting for treaty rights that were promised and then ignored. But the copper country itself slipped away, and almost immediately the modern copper rush began. American mining companies poured into the copper country, shafts went down, towns went up. Immigrants arrived by the thousands to work underground, from Cornwall and Finland and Italy and a dozen other places, and the region became one of the great industrial engines of the young country. And here is the fact that should stop you cold. From the 1840s to the late 1800s, this region became the leading copper producer in the entire United States. In the second half of the 1800s, the mines around Lake Superior produced more than half of the copper in the world. In some years, Michigan alone produced the overwhelming majority of the copper in the whole country. And how did those companies find the richest veins? A lot of the time, they followed the ancient pits. The old workings were a map. The first miners had already located the best copper thousands of years earlier, and the new arrivals simply dug where the old ones had dug. One mining company on Isle Royale, the Minong Mining Company, actually said so in print in the 1870s. They boasted that in opening their principal mines, they had followed in the path of their ancient predecessors, just with better tools for going deep. Read that again. They followed in the path of their ancient predecessors. They knew. Standing in the pits, holding the old stone hammers, digging where ancient hands had already dug, the modern miners knew perfectly well that skilled people had been there long before them. And at the very same time, the respectable men in the lecture halls were insisting those skilled people could not possibly have been the ancestors of the native families who had just been moved off that same land. The industry profited off the ancient miners' knowledge while the culture erased the ancient miners' descendants. Both things were happening at once, in the same place, over the same copper. So what does the science actually say now, with all our modern tools? It says the old man in the mission house was closer to the truth than any of the yacht expeditions ever got. The archaeological consensus today is clear. The old copper culture was indigenous. The mines were dug by native peoples of the Great Lakes, working continuously with their own technology across thousands of years. There is a real and honest nuance here, and it is worth saying plainly. The very oldest miners, from 6,000 and 7,000 and 8,000 years ago, lived so long ago that they predate the specific modern Ojibwe bands who live there now by a great span of time. Cultures shifted, moved, and changed across those millennia, the way they do everywhere on Earth. But that is a completely different thing from a vanished foreign race. These were indigenous people of this continent, part of the same deep, continuous native world, using homegrown technologies, part of the same story that runs forward to the Anishinaabe and their sacred relationship with the metal. As Susan Martin put it, the careful excavation of these sites shows the copper used right alongside all the other tools and pottery that are, without question, the products of native technologies. There is no mystery race. There never was. The pit and the pictograph and the dictionary all point to the same answer. The lost race was never in the ground. It was never in the rock at all. It was in the story people told about the ground, and you would think that would be the end of it. Case closed. Myth debunked in 1894, confirmed by a century of science since, the record set straight. So why am I telling you this like it still matters? Because it does. Because the machine that built the mound builder myth never actually got shut down. It just changes its wardrobe every few decades and comes back around. You have probably run into the newest version already, maybe without realizing what you were looking at. Scroll far enough and you will find videos claiming that the real builders of the ancient world were a lost global empire, sometimes called Tartaria, a vanished super-civilization supposedly erased from the history books. You will find claims that the great buildings and monuments of the past were built by some forgotten advanced race, and that the people who came after them, us, just moved into the ruins and took the credit. You will find the whole genre of shows insisting that the pyramids, or the great earthworks, or the stone temples of ancient peoples must have been built by visitors from the stars, because surely ordinary humans of that time and place could not have managed it on their own. Different props, same script, and underneath every version of it you will find the exact same emotional engine running. There is always a mysterious lost civilization. There are always achievements too impressive to be believed. And there is always a real group of ordinary human beings quietly written out of their own history so that the achievement can be handed to somebody more mysterious, more romantic, and conveniently gone. I am not saying every person who finds these stories fascinating has a bad motive. Most of them are just curious, and the mysteries are genuinely fun to think about. That is exactly why the pattern is so durable. It feels like wonder. It feels like you are being let in on a secret the establishment is hiding, but look at the shape of it. Look at what it actually does. It takes a real achievement by real people, decides those people were too primitive or too ordinary to have done it, and awards the achievement to a phantom. And almost every single time, the real people getting robbed are the same ones who have been getting robbed for centuries. The copper miners of Lake Superior were not a lost white race, or Phoenicians, or refugees from Atlantis. They were the ancestors of the people who were still standing there when the surveyors arrived, still working copper, still telling their children about the underwater panther that guarded it. They accomplished something extraordinary. They built some of the oldest metalworking tradition on the planet, in the cold woods of the north, with fire and stone and thousands of years of patience, and that accomplishment was taken from them twice. First, when their land was signed away and their copper was mined for profit, and again, when their history was handed to an invented race of strangers so that nobody would have to admit what had been done. So let's go back one last time to the mission house, to the old man and the priest, and that unanswered question. Maybe he really was one of the last of his community to carry the old knowledge in the old way, in a world that was closing in fast around him. When the priest asked who dug the pits, he was reaching for a name to write in a book. What he got instead was the truth, offered in a form he was not equipped to receive. The copper is alive. It has wonderful power. It has always belonged to these waters, and to a people who have always known it. There was no vanished race. There was only us, and the ones before us, all the way down. The priest wanted a tribe to name. The old man had already named it. He named it every time he spoke his own language, the language a snowshoe priest had spent his life writing down. Anishinaabe, the original people, the first ones. They were the answer the whole time. Everyone was just looking for a more comfortable one. And the next time a video promises you a lost super-civilization that the historians are supposedly too scared to talk about, I want you to remember the pits on Isle Royale and the stone hammers lying where they were dropped, and the old man in the mission house who told the truth to a man who could not hear it. Ask yourself the one question that cuts straight through every version of this story, the old one and the new one alike. If there is a lost civilization in the picture, who benefits from the people who were really there being forgotten? Because that question has an answer too. It has always had an answer, plain and honest as daylight, and it is not a mystery at all.